So we're going to survey some ideas that have come up recently about Atlantis, archetypes, and Platonic forms. So let's dig into it to see what's going on. So in Western philosophy and psychology, Atlantis, the notion of archetypes and Platonic forms are deeply interconnected through the works of Plato and later interpretations by Carl Jung. So they represent a progression from a specific philosophical allegory to a universal psychological framework. In fact, there's a scientific aspect to this with Ron Gowan, where he showed that information that coats the walls of the compartments of the ether that make up the space all around us, that information links everything and creates the Platonic forms, the archetypes, and so forth. And so it's not simply psychology, it's not simply uh, philosophy. It's actually based on scientific observation under deep meditation. So the Platonic forms are these universal blueprints. They're the algorithms that are there in the information that Ron Cowan saw. And Plato's theory of forms is the foundation for both archetypes and the story of Atlantis. He argued that the physical world is a mere shadow of a higher non-physical realm containing eternal, perfect, and unchanging forms. So the concept here is that for every object or concept in our world, like a tree or justice, there's a perfect form in this higher reality. There is an imperfect reality that we live in. Everything we see with our senses is this imperfect copy of the original blueprint. So Plato introduced the story of Atlantis in his dialogues of Timaeus and Critias around 360 BC as a philosophical allegory rather than a historical record. He had actually gone to Egypt. He talked with the Egyptians, as did Pythagoras, and they told him a lot of the stories uh, of Atlantis, that Egypt was in fact the colony of Atlantis. So the allegory here uh, that he came away with was Atlantis was a powerful naval empire and it became morally corrupt. It appears what happened was it was subverted by extraterrestrials that corrupted it. It didn't happen on its own, but it serves as a tale of what happens when a society abandons virtue and succumbs to hubris. So there's a fallen form in the sense. Atlantis represents the form of a failed civilization. Actually, it was a perfect model of how an ideal state can operate, but then it decayed through the flaws of humans, but the human flaws were exploited by these extraterrestrials. The archetypes, uh, the term comes from the Greek word meaning original pattern, and it was popularized by Carl Jung, who moved Plato's forms from a realm of the sky into the human psyche, but it's in much more, as we've seen. There's the Jungian interpretation that the archetypes are universal, innate patterns and images that reside in the collective unconsciousness. And then there's Atlantis as an archetype. Atlantis is often viewed as the psychological archetype, the lost paradise, the golden age that we subconsciously yearn to return to. So the history of Atlantis, according to Plato, which he again got from the Egyptians, was Atlantis, which is literally the island of Atlas, was an island mentioned in Timaeus and Critias. Uh, he described Atlantis as a naval empire from the west that conquered most of Europe and Libya, and Plato purposely created a literary contrast with the Achaemenid Empire, the great land-based power that ruled the East in what the Greeks called Asia. In Plato's account, the Atlantis lose divine favor after an ill-fated campaign against a fictionalized Athens and subsequently submerges into the Atlantic Ocean. This isn't what really happened, but it's what Plato chose to talk about by portraying the victorious Athens in the image of his ideal state from the Republic, Plato intended the Atlantis story to bear witness to the superiority of his concept of a state. So let's look at Timaeus. For what does Timaeus actually say? This is a direct quote, for it's related in our records that once upon a time your state stayed the course of a mighty host, which starting from a distant point in the Atlantic Ocean was insolently advanced to attack the whole of Europe and Asia to boot. For the ocean there was at that time navigable, for in front of the mouth which you Greeks call, as you say, the Pillars of Hercules there lay an island which was larger than Libya and Asia together. That was the island of Atlantis. And the quote continues, it was possible for travelers of that time to cross from it to other islands, from other islands to the whole of the continent, over against them which encompasses that veritable ocean. For all that we have here lying within the mouth of which we speak is evidently a haven having a narrow entrance. But that yonder is a real ocean, and the land surrounding it may most rightly be called, in the fullest and truest sense, a continent. Now, in this land of Atlantis, there existed a confederation of kings of great and marvelous power, which held sway over all the island and over many other islands also, and parts of the continent. And that an island of such nature and size once existed is evidence from what is said by certain authors who investigated the things around the outer sea. For according to them, there were 7 islands in that sea in their time, sacred to Persephone, and 3 others of enormous size, one of which was sacred to Hades, another to Amnon, and another one between them to Poseidon, the extent of which was 1,000 stadia, or roughly 200 kilometers, 124 miles. And the inhabitants of it, they added, preserved the remembrance of their ancestors of the immeasurably large island of Atlantis, which had really existed there and which for many ages had reigned over all islands in the Atlantic Sea, and which itself had likewise been sacred to Poseidon. Now, these things Marcellus has written in his Aethiopico. Now, let's look at what Critias said. That was to all Timaeus. So, according to the Critias, 9,000 years before his lifetime, a war took place between those outside the Pillars of Hercules at the Strait of Gibraltar and those who dwelt within them. And the Atlanteans had conquered the parts of Libya within the Pillars of Hercules as far as Egypt and the European continent as far as Tyrrhenia, and had subjected its people to slavery. And the Athenians, led by an alliance of resistors against the Atlantean, as the alliance disintegrated, prevailed alone and liberated the occupied lands. But afterwards there occurred violent earthquakes and floods, and in a single day and night of misfortune, all your warlike men in a body sank into the earth, and the island of Atlantis in like manner disappeared in the depths of the sea. For which reason the sea in those parts is impassable and impenetrable, because of the shoal of mud in the way, and this was caused by the subsidence of the island. Let's continue with Critias. So we now switch to what Madame Blavatsky and the Theosophy had to say about this. Madame Blavatsky wrote The Secret Doctrine in 1888, and she claimed it was originally dictated in Atlantis. She maintained that the Atlanteans were cultural heroes, contrary to Plato, who described them mainly as a military threat. And she believed in a form of racial evolution as opposed to primate evolution. In her process of evolution, the Atlanteans were the 4th root race, and they were succeeded by the 5th, the Aryan race, which she identified with the modern human race. The races before that we think were related to, for example, ants or insects, reptiles, and perhaps avians. We're not sure. So in her book of The Secret Doctrine, Blavatsky reported that the civilization of Atlantis had reached its peak perhaps 1,000,000 to 900,000 years ago, but then destroyed itself through internal warfare brought about by the dangerous use of psychic and supernatural powers of the inhabitants. To pick up on this, Rudolf Steiner, who's the founder of anthropophagy and the Waldorf schools, along with other well-known theosophists such as Annie Besant, also wrote of cultural evolution in much the same vein as Blavatsky. And other occultists followed the same lead, at least to the point, tracing the lineage of occult practices back to Atlantis. Among the most famous of these is Dion Fortune and her esoteric orders and works. But Blavatsky was also inspired by the work of the 18th century astronomer Jean Sylvain Bailly, who had orientalized the Atlantis myth in his mythical continent of Hyperborea, which is a reference to Greek myths featuring a northern European region of the same name, Hyperborea, home to a giant godlike race. Dan Edelstein uh, claims that her reshaping of this theory in The Secret Doctrine provided the Nazis with a mythological precedence and a pretext for their ideological platform and subsequent genocide. However, Blavatsky's writings mention that the Atlanteans were in fact olive-skinned people with Mongoloid traits. They're the ancestors of the modern Native Americans, Mongolians, and Malayans, not the Aryans that Hitler presented. The idea that the Atlanteans were Hyperborean or Nordic Supermen originated in the North Atlantic was popular with the German aristocrats, but it got its name from the Thule Gesellschaft, an anti-Semitic Munich lodge that preceded the German Nazi Party, and the scholars there were the first to speak of Nordic Atlantean or Aryan Nordic master race that spread from Atlantis over the northern hemisphere and beyond. So the Hyperboreans were contrasted with the German people, and the Nazi Party ideologist Alfred Rosenberg in The Myth of the 20th Century wrote, as well as did Heinrich Himmler, that this is really the official doctrine of the Nazi Party. And this was followed up by adherents of esoteric Nazism that continue to crop up today. Now, Edgar Cayce uh, was clairvoyant, and he spoke frequently of Atlantis. And during his life readings, he claimed that many of his subjects were reincarnations of people who had lived there. And by tapping into their collective consciousness, the Akashic records, that term he borrowed from Theosophy, Cayce declared he's able to give detailed descriptions of the lost continents. And he asserted that Atlantis would rise again in the 1960s, sparking a popularity of the myth, and that there's a hall of records beneath the Egyptian Sphinx, which holds the historical text of Atlantis, as well as two more. So the fact that Atlantis is a lost land has made it a metaphor for something no longer attainable. For the American poet Edith Forbes, the lost Atlantis stands for the idealization of the past. The present moment can be only treasured once that is realized. Ella Wilcox finds the location of the lost land in one's carefree, youthful past. And the Irish poet Evan Bolan in Atlantis, a lost sonnet. The idea was to find where the old fable makers searched hard for a word to convey what is gone forever. So there you have it, a short survey of Atlantis archetypes.